Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Later, I'll be joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and we'll be discussing the Labour leadership has been somewhat humiliated at party conference. Bosses are mad at Labour too. That's for paying £3,000 each for a flop event. It has a kind of fire festival element to it. And Starmer has finally faced the media over winter fuel payments and Giftgate criticism. First, though, events in Lebanon. The Lebanese Health Ministry has said that at least 51 people have been killed today by Israeli strikes, bringing the total death toll of this round of attacks to over 600 people. Separately, the Lebanese Health Ministry, which is not associated with Hezbollah, told the New York Times that the overwhelming majority, if not all, of the people killed on Monday and Tuesday were civilians. The Israeli Air Force claim they have hit 280 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon today. The chief of the general staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, has told ground troops, this is significant, that the airstrikes have taken place to, quote, prepare the ground for your possible entry, and told the soldiers to prepare. Obviously, that sounds like a ground invasion. Keir Starmer has issued urgent advice for British nationals living in Lebanon.
I have a very important message for British nationals in Lebanon, which is the time to leave is now. The contingency plans are being ramped up, but don't wait for those. There are still commercial flights. It's very important that they hear my message, which is to leave and to leave immediately.
The UK is, of course, continuing to supply weapons to Israel, though it suspended around 10% of arms export licenses on the 2nd of September. So it's telling its citizens to evacuate a country which is potentially going to get bombed with weapons, as we say often on this show, not principally British weapons, they're mainly American and German, but with weapons with potential British parts. Meanwhile, Axios is reporting that the United States is preparing a plan for a temporary Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire. They report the US has been discussing the idea of a ceasefire with France, Israel, Lebanon, and several other Arab countries. Axios write this: the aim is to achieve a pause that will give space for negotiations on a broader diplomatic deal to prevent a wider war, allow displaced civilians to return to their homes on both sides of the border, and provide renewed momentum for a Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal. A source with direct knowledge of the plans told Axios. I'm joined now by David Waring, an expert on British foreign relations in the Middle East. David, thank you for joining us. I suppose those comments from Keir Starmer especially, to a British audience, makes it seem as if a full-blown war is now inevitable. Is that your interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, he must be getting intelligence communications from the Israelis, perhaps from the Americans as well, telling him that. It says something, I suppose, for his confidence in terms of Israel's willingness to apply international law and not hit civilian targets. He's telling British civilians to leave Lebanon. We'll see if he tells British civilians to leave Israel. But no, it looks clearly like it's a severe escalation, and it is war now. It's gone beyond the sort of attritional war that we've seen over the past few months, where there's been attacks from both sides across that Israeli-Lebanon border, but they've been kept to a certain limit, and both sides have been broadly avoiding hitting civilian targets. But no, this has gone way above that. It's a full-scale war at this point.
Because Hezbollah is a non-state actor, I mean, obviously it has representatives in the Lebanese state, but principally its militant wing, I suppose, is a non-state actor. I think that means sort of war is a term which often seems to be used inconsistently. It's somewhat confusing. Can Israel be at war with Hezbollah? At what point would Israel be at war with Lebanon? Are they already at war with Lebanon? How should we sort of understand this?
Well, I mean, I guess with Gaza, they're at war with Hamas, but their way of fighting war is to wage it on the entire civilian population. And it's going to be something similar to that in Lebanon, as it was in 2006, where, just for people cast their minds back if they remember 18 years ago. I mean, it's just flagrant attacks on civilian targets with the pretty clear aim, it seems to me and to others, that they were trying to inflict pain on Lebanese civilians in the hope that Lebanese civilians would then turn against Hezbollah in much the same way as they've been doing with Hamas. And I mean, it's standard colonial counterinsurgency. The British did it during the days of the British Empire, the French did it, the Americans did it, and the Israelis are doing it now. It is classic stuff. In those days, you'd poison the wells, you'd burn the crops, you'd kill the livestock, you'd blockade the villages, and then you'd tell them you either give up the rebels or it's going to get worse. And this looks to me like something similar. So, yeah, I mean, it's an operation against a non-state actor, but in practice, that means war on the country and war on the civilian population. You mentioned there the statement that most of the people killed so far have been civilians. This death toll, 600 people. That 2006 war that Israel waged on Hezbollah and Lebanon more generally, in a month they only killed 1,000 people. I mean, only, it's a lot of people, but for them to have killed 600 people in 2 days, more than half the number they killed in a month in 2006, it tells you something about the way this is already being fought.
What will Hezbollah be thinking in this situation? Because, I mean, it seems as if Israel want a war. It seems as if they want a pretext to sort of have a ground invasion. And I suppose they get the pretext if Hezbollah sort of do a more dramatic attack than they have done so far. At the same time, Hezbollah will feel like they have to respond, to some degree. So many of their people and, people with any associations with their people have been blown up by these pages. You've now had these airstrikes. If they don't respond in a dramatic way, they look like a complete paper tiger. So what sort of weighing up will they be doing?
Well, I think you've captured it very well there. I mean, this is the kind of also the dilemma that they're on. On the one hand, I mean, it seems clear to me that they don't want a full-scale war. When Hamas attacked Israel on the 7th of October last year, Hezbollah got involved after that because that's kind of what's expected of them. And they would have looked perhaps weak if they'd allowed Israel to attack Gaza without them sort of weighing in. But the attacks, the cross-border attacks, have been quite limited. There's been a quite limited, controlled war of attrition going on along that border. And it seems to me that, and people have said this many, many times over the last few months, the Israelis want an escalation. They want a wider regional war. They want to keep the war going. Netanyahu, in particular, for obvious reasons, because he wants to stay in government, he wants to stay out of jail. And part of trying to escalate things has been trying to goad Hezbollah and trying to goad Iran as well into a response. And they've been reasonably controlled up till now in terms of not going beyond what they're already doing. But there will come a point when Hezbollah will surely have to say, if we sit here and don't respond to the full extent that we can, even when our weapons are being degraded, when our capacity is being degraded by these attacks, that point will have to come at some point where we have to fight back in a more sustained way. They've got more to deploy in this war than they've used up till now. They're far better equipped than Hamas is in terms of missiles, etc. That they're an altogether different base to Hamas. So this could be a really, really significant conflict in the next few weeks, depending on how it goes.
The Americans obviously saying they're trying to negotiate a ceasefire. They're talking to different parties. I wouldn't blame any of our audience for thinking they've heard all of this before. Would people be right to dismiss out of hand sort of the American claim that they're working towards a ceasefire here?
I think it's a bit on the one hand, on the other. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think the Americans necessarily wanted any of this. They wouldn't have chosen any of this. And they don't want it to get out of hand. They don't want a regional war. They know probably it's not good for Kamala Harris because it will start to, if there's a fresh round of Israeli atrocities over the next few weeks, that's going to put pressure on the Novara coalition she's trying to assemble if she wants to beat Donald Trump. So they don't necessarily want any of this. At the same time, they're not prepared to take the steps they know they can take to stop the whole thing. I mean, the epicenter of all of this is Gaza. There's been a ceasefire deal that everyone's known the terms of for a long time. There's a broad consensus at this point that it's Netanyahu who's the major factor, not the only factor, but the major factor in blocking it. And the Americans have it within their power to force him to sign that deal, because the Americans can withdraw the military support that sustains all of these operations, all of these war crimes, crimes against humanity, potentially genocide. They can, they can put a stop to that quite easily if they want to. It's that unwillingness to do it that's the puzzle. Why is there the unwillingness to do it? I mean, it could be because they want ultimately to see Israel prevail over its enemies. They may see geostrategic alignment between what Israel's trying to do and what they want in the region. It could be they're worried about how would it play if they pulled support for Israel in the middle of an election, because there's two different directions in which they could lose votes on this, depending on what they do. But yeah, certainly the power sits with the Americans, and what we're living with here now, and what Lebanese people now are experiencing, is the cost of the Americans and the West, including Britain, including Labour, not putting the pressure on Israel that was necessary to stop all this months ago. People like you and me and many other people, and people who've campaigned against all this, have warned that it will get out of hand and even worse will come, and that's what we're seeing.
David, I want your thoughts on another related story about the Americans. This is about Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and I'll show you a headline from ProPublica. So it says, Israel deliberately blocked humanitarian aid to Gaza. Two government bodies concluded, so they're American government bodies. Antony Blinken rejected them, Antony Blinken being the American Secretary of State. The story is significant because under American law, the government is required to cut off weapons shipments to any countries that prevent the delivery of US-backed humanitarian aid. What the story reveals, is that the US Agency for International Development and the State Department's Refugees Bureau both said Israel was blocking the delivery of American aid. The Agency for International Development, or USAID, provided a particularly detailed 17-page memo describing instances of Israel interfering with the supply of humanitarian aid. Examples included killing aid workers, bombing ambulances and hospitals, sitting on supply depots, and routinely turning away trucks full of food and medicine. However, on the 10th of May, Blinken made the opposite claim to Congress. He told them this: "We do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of US humanitarian assistance." Antony Blinken was asked about this story on CBS this morning.
Mr. Secretary, ProPublica has determined that two agencies found that Israel is deliberately stopping humanitarian aid from getting to civilians. And as you well know, the U.S. government says that it has to restrict supplying weapons to a country that does this type of thing. Why have we not done so?
Yeah. So this is actually pretty typical. We had a report to put out on the humanitarian situation in Gaza and what Israel was doing to try to make sure that people got the assistance they needed. And I had different assessments from different parts of the State Department, from other agencies that were involved, like USAID. My job is to sort through them, which I did, draw some conclusions from that, and we put out our report. And we found that Israel needed to do a better job on the humanitarian assistance. We've seen improvements since then. It's still not sufficient.
Do you buy that line? He's saying, oh yeah, we did get these reports saying they were blocking US aid. And that would mean, or US sort of humanitarian assistance, and that would mean that it was illegal for us to send them weapons. But I also received other reports from other departments which told me presumably the opposite, and I came to the conclusion that actually everything's basically fine. Although I suppose he said, I came to the conclusion that they're not really blocking it, but they could improve a few things. But anyway, we can still send them loads of weapons. It's all okay. What did you make of that response from him? How significant do you think this story is?
It's highly significant, and his response is just flagrantly dishonest. We don't even need to spend time, discussing it. In the quote you put up a minute ago, where he says, "I do not currently assess," if you want the truth, it's "I do not want to currently assess." That Israel's blocking this aid. Everyone knows Israel's blocking the aid. All the relevant humanitarian organisations say Israel's blocking aid. All the relevant NGOs, human rights NGOs, say Israel's blocking the aid. All the relevant UN bodies, UN officials say Israel's blocking the aid. The chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court says Israel's blocking the aid. And in terms of the US state, it's the US aid, and it's the specific part of the State Department that is most closely engaged with what Israel's doing on the ground, who've drawn these conclusions. So everyone credible is drawing the same conclusion. And the person who's not drawing that conclusion is the person who doesn't want to draw a conclusion. Because if he draws that conclusion, then he has to stop providing arms to the Israelis. And for strategic reasons, the Americans don't want to do that. So it's clear what's happening. And again, I repeat the point that this is absolutely standard counterinsurgency practice to punish the civilians in the hope they'll turn against the armed group. In this case, it's escalated to a point of genocide. But I mean, this is not a case of people burying their heads in the sand and not wanting to believe certain things, or not convincing themselves that the truth isn't the truth. I mean, it's just clear that they know. And I mean, it's got legal implications as well, right? Because if this is a genocide, if these are war crimes, then the complicity of the US, including the Secretary of State, is crystal clear. He was warned in no uncertain terms, in explicit terms, by the parts of the US government that would know best, and he deliberately overruled them. So, hopefully someday he sees the inside of a prison cell for that, as should Biden. But no, it's pretty clear what's happening here, I think.
Let's turn to the Brits and a slightly different story. Today, Foreign Secretary David Lammy attended the UN Security Council, where he said this to his Russian counterparts.
Your invasion is in your own interests, yours alone, to expand your mafia state into a mafia empire, an empire built on corruption, robbing from the Russian people as well as Ukraine, an empire built on crushing dissent, courageous opponents like Navalny, an empire built on lies, spreading disinformation at home and abroad to sow disorder. Mr. President, I speak not only as a Briton, as a Londoner, and as a Foreign Secretary, but I say to the Russian representative on his phone as I speak, that I stand here also as a black man whose ancestors were taken in chains from Africa at the barrel of a gun to be enslaved, whose ancestors rose up and fought in a great rebellion of the enslaved. Imperialism, I know it when I see it, and I will call it out for what it is.
So those were very strong words from David Lammy directed at the Russians. Obviously, he doesn't manage as much passion when he's talking about Israel and the Palestinians. What can we say so far about sort of Labour's approach to international affairs in general under this new Starmer government?
It's business as usual, I guess, or it's a reversion to the status quo. I mean, if you think about the two sort of main parties in British politics as kind of two competing sets of managers, perhaps more traditionally the case that the Conservatives were seen as the safe pair of hands for the status quo, and Labour was seen as something of a threat to that. But generally speaking, Labour has been over the years domesticated, and notwithstanding the sort of Corbyn interregnum, they're now bidding effectively to be seen as the more natural party of government, where the Conservatives have become quite radical, and as a result of their radicalism, doing things like Brexit, which isn't in the interest of the wider British state and British capitalism. Labour is now presenting itself as the reliable party of the status quo that wouldn't have done something like Brexit, although they're not going to reverse it, but which can be relied upon by British military, security services, Britain's allies, and British capital to run the system in a way that's conducive to the interests of those kind of established interests. And in terms of the diplomacy, whether it's with the Europeans or with the Americans over the last couple of months since the election, it's all about broadcasting that, basically. Normal services resumed. You're not going to get any more of this strange stuff that you had with Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. We're reliable, sensible managers. We're all on the same side as the rest of you. We share your concerns, we share your priorities, and we're going to help you pursue them. So we're seeing that with Ukraine in particular. Nothing that Lammy says about Russia in any of that clip that you just showed is wrong. It's just, I know it's an obvious point, but you could say these things about plenty of British allies which will continue to get support from David Lammy, and on which we won't hear sort of passionate denunciations of the kind you just played.
Starmer has suffered a humiliating defeat at Labour conference. A trade union-sponsored motion calling on ministers to reverse cuts to winter fuel payments has passed by a narrow margin. General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham, opened the debate with a passionate speech.
People simply do not understand. I do not understand how our new Labour government can cut the winter fuel allowance for pensioners and leave the super rich untouched. This is not what people voted for. It's the wrong decision and it needs to be reversed. Friends, we are the 6th richest economy in the world. We have the money. Britain needs investment, not austerity Mark II. We won't get any gold badges for shaving peanuts off our debt. These fiscal rules are self-imposed and the decision to keep them is hanging like a noose around our necks. Friends, our public services and British industry need investment now. It's no good having sympathy for workers in Grangemouth losing their jobs. They do not want your pity. They need Labour to step up to the plate and not allow a billionaire who buys a football club as a hobby to throw these workers on the scrap heap. We cannot leave Britain to the whim of footloose corporations. Hoping and willing for those corporations to invest is a prayer, it is not a plan. Yes, Britain is broken, and yes, the Tories have left the mess, and yes, they are to blame. But Labour is now in government, and we cannot keep making everyday people pay. Friends, I keep hearing, a wealth tax is too difficult. It would take too long, and I say absolute rubbish. We seem to be able to get workers paying their taxes in a matter of weeks. The system is rigged and the country knows it. Friends, let's hold up our heads and be proud to be Labour. Let everyday people know we are on their side. Let's put our arms around the working class and make lasting change. Solidarity, I move.
Oof, she had some fire in her belly. Not willing to sort of give Starmer the benefit of the doubt. New government, let's be nicey. No, she was full on there. Very persuasive, I think. The motion on the winter fuel payment was seconded by Alan Tate of the CWU, who said this.
The CWU has been inundated with emails and calls from our retired members worried about choosing between heating and eating. Experts are warning that this could increase the risk of illness or even death for vulnerable people this winter. Now, we have heard from both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor describe this cut as a tough choice. But conference, the tough choice is not about switching off pensioners' heating this winter. The real choice is about picking up the phone to the tech giants like Amazon and the ultra-wealthy and making them pay their fair share of tax.
So those were the arguments that won the day, because that motion was passed to sort of oppose Labour's policy on the winter fuel payment. Wes Streeting, though, appeared on BBC Politics Live, and he was challenged to defend the policy, even though his own party's conference had voted against it.
The question, Wes, we're just talking about, can you take the country with you? You can't even take conference with you.
Well, hang on a second. We should not lose sight of the fact that we came into government to find a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. Unlike our Conservative predecessors, we are not going to duck those difficult choices, pretend that you can just ratchet up borrowing and you can play fast and loose with the public finances. Yeah. Keir Starmer was clear in opposition and now clear in government.
Why haven't you persuaded? Yeah, but why haven't you persuaded Sharon Graham? These are choices. She said, "I can't believe a new Labour government is doing this." If you can't persuade her and you can't persuade the majority of people here, how can you persuade the country?
Well, and I say this with great respect and affection for Sharon Graham, so I do have a lot of respect for her. Can we set the bar of expectations in the right place? I'm not sure we're ever going to persuade Sharon. And look, the thing about delegates to party conference, whether they're from our constituencies or trade unions, they get the chance to put their points across and they get the chance to speak up in the ways that, on the issues that they care about and give us the advice that they think we should follow. But ultimately, it's us, the government, the Parliamentary Labour Party, that don't have the luxury of ducking the difficult choices and decisions. So we've had to make those choices. And let me tell you, people would not thank us if we ducked the difficult decisions and then the country paid a much heavier price down the road.
Liam.
That's where the Conservatives took us. We're not going back there again.
The really strange thing of all of this is that they've made such a big deal out of the winter fuel payment, as in, because I suppose because Rachel Reeves almost offered it as a sacrifice to the market. She said, you can tell that we're serious because we're going to punish pensioners. And the markets didn't care. Like the Financial Times, all of these papers, when they speak to these market experts, they say, we didn't really need her to do that, right? It's 1.4 billion pounds or whatever. Everyone seems to have quite a lot of faith that Rachel Reeves isn't someone who's just really desperate to splurge loads of cash on stuff. If anything, she sounds actually more fiscally conservative than, I suppose, the IMF and the OECD at the moment, right? I don't think Labour have in any way spooked the markets, but by sort of putting forward this sacrificial lamb, they've definitely spooked the public. Like, it's backfired so fundamentally. Of course, the motion itself, passing at conference, it doesn't have any direct impact on government policy. The government are free to ignore it, as we kind of assume they will. If they're thinking, though, this is just a bunch of delegates at conference, they're all lefties like Sharon Graham who wouldn't like us anyway, well, they would be wrong. Here's what Canterbury MP Rosie Duffield had to say. I'm glad the Labour Party conference and CWU News have voted to keep the winter fuel allowance. Our party was created to protect the most vulnerable, and today it has determined that it must never step back from that mandate. I trust the government can now keep our pensioners safe and warm. And so I suppose Rosie Duffield there suggesting that maybe they will change course. I suppose they might come up with something. I don't think they will do a U-turn, because that would, politicians don't like doing U-turns, especially this early in a government. The Greens, as you'd imagine, have taken the opportunity to capitalise on Labour's internal divisions, releasing a statement in support of the trade union motion. Co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer, said this: today's vote at Labour Party conference leaves Labour ministers out in the cold. There is a groundswell of support from opposition parties, unions, many Labour MPs, health workers, disability groups, charities supporting pensioners, as well as others, for ensuring millions of pensioners keep warm this winter. Targeting some of the most vulnerable to fix a supposed black hole in the public finances is cruel and unnecessary. There is another way, a fairer way, as the successful motion by Unite makes clear. Taxing multimillionaires and billionaires a little more would not only easily cover the cost of winter fuel payments for all pensioners, but also generate additional funds for much needed investment in our health and social care services. I'm joined now by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. I think it's pretty clear for all to see that Labour's winter fuel policy has well and truly backfired. Does this conference motion passing change anything? Does it add to that, or do you think this is just one more voice of dissent against Labour's decision and it won't make much difference?
We have seen essentially for the last 4 years, both members, regular members who voted to pass this motion, and the unions that tabled this motion at the conference have entirely been sidelined when it comes to actually setting policy in terms of where Labour go in terms of when they're in the government. Like at the National Policy Forum meeting, trade union representatives from GMB and Unite literally stormed out of the lunch after having to get beaten down by the Starmer Politburo on policies around workers' rights and things like that. So the idea that a motion at conference, when people who are close to the Labour Party in lobbying documents describe the membership as being seen as a problem to be managed rather than people to be welcomed, shows you that I really don't think they're going to take this motion and care about it at all. What is funny, though, is that they actually deliberately tried to schedule the vote and the motion discussion in like the graveyard slot right at the end. And that was supposed to be to hide it from the rest of the conference, but all it did was meant that it was the last thing that got reported on. So it took up a bunch of media time that it wouldn't have done if they'd held it at a different time. Another win for the Labour communications team, which seems to be taking L after L for the last however many weeks now, and just shows you they're not quite as politically, strategically well-minded as you might think. What I do find interesting as well, though, is that hopefully this gives a lot of the right-wingers who have been also as rightfully aggrieved over this policy means test over the winter fuel payment, if they might give them a little bit of time to have some introspection on this, in that we had people like Mel Stride, as we saw a few weeks ago, talking about Labour need to look into their conscience to know this is terrible, whilst also supporting heinous welfare cuts elsewhere in the budget. And of course, a bunch of the right-wingers and the people who are voted Conservative, who are in the over 65 group, which the plurality of them did in 2024 and the majority did in 2019 and 2017, might look at themselves and go, well, hang on a minute. If we're mad about this welfare payment being cut, maybe we should have been mad about all of those other welfare payments that got cut, which we wholeheartedly supported when that was happening. Looking now and seeing, well, actually the people who've had a consistent position on welfare cuts being bad, which they haven't had, it's not the Conservatives, it's not Reform UK, and it's not the Labour right. It is people on the left. It is Jeremy Corbyn and people like that, and the Green Party, and people like the Scottish National Party, and other smaller parties like Plaid Cymru, who have actually had a continually consistent position on opposing welfare cuts, and of course the trade unions, who often get maligned by the Conservative Party voters. And we might think, well, if we're agreeing with the trade unions, Jeremy Corbyn and Carla Denyer on this, maybe the left have had a point about all of the other welfare cuts that have happened.
After conspicuously avoiding any media appearances on Sunday, Starmer has hit a full round of interviews following his conference speech. It's fair to say he didn't get an easy ride.
You mentioned that you are dedicated to providing a government service for working people. You must have mentioned working people at least 13 times in your speech. What about the people who have worked all of their lives, paid into the state, pensioners? How can you justify taking away up to £300 from those formerly working people?
Well, it's tough. And I think the first thing to say is, and to explain, is why we had to do it. We inherited a really damaged economy. We did an audit and we discovered an undisclosed £22 billion black hole this year, which we have to fix. That
black hole includes public sector pay rises.
Well, the last government set up the pay review bodies for the public sector. It knew that they would come back with about £9 billion worth of recommendations. Some of those recommendations came back and the government put them on the desk and didn't deal with them. They ran away. Okay. But they allocated 0 pence towards that settlement. That is not the way to run the economy. So I'm not going to accept this challenge that somehow by paying that, because there's a £22 billion black hole.
Well, there's a £22 billion black hole. I hadn't heard about that before. You can see what the Labour strategists were thinking with this. They thought that this was, they were playing 4-dimensional chess. What we're going to do, we're going to get into government, and we're going to talk loads and loads about what we've inherited from the Conservatives. So a bit like in the 2010s, people blame the previous guys for all the problems. So obviously, with the Conservatives in the 2010s, it was saying Labour overspent and that's why we got a financial crisis, even though that's not why we got a financial crisis. We got a financial crisis because there was irresponsible lending in the United States. But there we go. That's a different story, a different episode. They thought they could do the same trick. I think one of the reasons it's backfired is because, and again, you could be a bit cynical here, actually, because when the Tories did it, they said, Labour have given us this really terrible inheritance and we're going to attack really weak people. So they went after people on disability benefits, people who didn't have much of a voice. The Labour Party said, we want to tell everyone that it's the last guy's fault. And then they attacked a group of people who are actually politically very influential, pensioners, right? So this was, I don't know how they didn't see this coming, but this has been an absolute political disaster, which isn't going away. Susanna Reid also showed Starmer a clip of a Labour voting pensioner called Chrissy, who has arthritis. She fears that this winter she won't be able to afford to put on the heating.
Would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to pensioners like Chrissy?
Well, I am really concerned that we've been put in this position. Mm-hmm. When you inherit an economy with £22 billion missing, it is a really difficult set of choices. But what I don't want to do is to allow the economy to run out of control. What I want to make sure is that every single pensioner, there is that increase through the triple lock each and every year, £460 next year because of the triple lock. We have to take that action, but I also have to fix the NHS. And talking to pensioners, so many of them want the NHS to work properly because they're dependent on it.
I just want to stick with this point about pensioners like Chrissy. And I asked you, would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to voters who voted for you, like Chrissy, pensioners who are about to lose hundreds this winter because of your choices?
What I'd say to Chrissy is this. I absolutely promised that we would stabilise the economy to make sure we never had the economy getting out of control again. We then discovered £22 billion missing.
Just because I've asked you a couple of times and you have just skirted round it, I did ask, would you like to take this opportunity to say sorry to the pensioners who feel hurt and less well off, certainly not better off, because you've taken away their winter fuel allowance? Would you like to say sorry?
The people who should be saying sorry are the last government who left a hole of £22 billion. And they should be sorry for that. They should apologise for that.
I don't think Chrissy's going to be particularly persuaded by that. And this is the big problem with, because I suppose, there are people in policy circles who like to means test stuff, who say that, if you're going to means test something, then the winter fuel allowance isn't a bad candidate because there are lots of wealthy pensioners. There are lots of wealthy pensioners out there who don't really need the £300. The problem is means testing is expensive, politically difficult, but also the pension credit is only received by quite a small, or a very small actually, proportion of pensioners. There are lots of people who don't quite qualify for pension credit, but who are still really struggling financially. Some of them, like Chrissy, have arthritis and are very terrified about going into this winter. So it was a mistake, and sorry seems to be the hardest word. I love that. Will you say sorry? I am very concerned. Not quite sorry, kind of close, but he won't admit that they've done anything wrong, and they don't want to admit a mistake this early in their term. That wasn't the only issue Starmer was asked to apologise for. LBC's Nick Ferrari had this.
We've just heard you say that we're all in this together. Service is the responsibility of power. Everything will be shared fairly. But as you know, this comes after day of negative headlines of how you and your senior colleagues have been in receipt of various gifts totaling tens of thousands of pounds. Why should my audience buy into what you've just said?
Well, look, Nick, I understand why questions are asked about things like donations. Some of my donations were things like clothes in the busy period running up to an election. I'm on the road, I'm focused on what I'm doing. People come forward and say I can help and make a donation towards clothes or something like that.
Why do you suppose they do that?
Well, I mean, in this particular case, it was a Labour peer, so he's got nothing to gain. He just wanted us to win the election, and that's why he did it. But look, Nick, let me be just really clear. I understand why you're asking me questions. And
we will move on from this, but we need to know.
That's important for me to say. Look, that was opposition. We're now in government, and therefore you won't be seeing any declarations from me in relation to clothing. Now we're in government. It's a different, we've turned a page, if you like.
Can you say, to use a footballing term, can you say sorry for an own goal?
Well, look, there was no breach of the rules or anything like that. We complied with everything.
But it has dominated part of this conference, and there is a cloud. So can you say, sorry, this was an own goal?
Look, Nick, I'm not going to apologise for not doing anything wrong, but I am going to recognise that you're asking me questions and people have asked questions. And I do understand
But if it's not doing anything wrong, why don't you carry on doing it?
Well, because I think, when you're running around in opposition, trying to just focus on winning that election, and people come forward and say, let me give you a bit of help with that, that's one thing. Now we're in government, that's another thing, which is why I've taken the decision, right or wrong, that I'm not going to be taking donations from clothes again.
The distinction seems a bit arbitrary. Of course, we were running around in opposition, and therefore you do take gifts from anyone when they offer them you. Now we're in government, we don't take gifts. I mean, if you're in opposition, they're still going to want favours, right? Because especially if you're ahead in the polls, they think you're going to be the next government. Why do you think they're doing it? I think in this situation, you could, because he says, I'm not going to apologise if I haven't done anything wrong, right? But obviously, I think 85% of the public now think he has done something wrong, or at least that sort of accepting these gifts is wrong. And you could quite easily fashion an apology here, because you say, look, I was thinking about lots of things over those 5 years, and basically we were of the view, if we're not breaking the rules, then it must be fine. It's become apparent that obviously people do feel very differently about that. I respect that they feel differently about that. We actually should have gone above and beyond the rules, not just followed the rules. I assure them that this hasn't changed, how we will behave or act in government. But, given the reaction, I respect the British people. I'm not going to stand here and say I haven't done anything wrong if they think I have. It was, we followed the rules, but that's not always good enough. Fair enough. I think people would probably be fairly accepting of that. They might even sort of warm to the guy for saying, I'm not going to apologise because I haven't done anything wrong. Sounds a little bit juvenile. Starmer is clearly desperate to put the freebies issue to bed and move on to other things, but yet another story has broken on this front. It concerns Starmer being gifted a 6-week stay at an £18 million penthouse during the general election. What's Starmer's excuse this time? That he had to take the freebie because his son needed somewhere quiet to study for his GCSEs. You may or may not find that a sympathetic argument, but there's one problem. The dates of the penthouse stay, which is recorded as being worth £20,000. They sort of had to put a somewhat arbitrary figure on it. I suppose maybe that's what it would have gone for on Airbnb. The dates they stayed there were from the 29th of May to the 13th of July this year. GCSE exams began on the 9th of May and were totally over by the 19th of June. So they got at least 3 weeks in that gaff after their son had been doing his GCSEs. I suppose they were waiting to move into Downing Street.
There was the interview and they desperately wanted Keir Starmer to say sorry. We're going to go specifically about the winter fuel payment, the one with Susanna Reid. And they're not going to do that. They're not going to apologise for this, fundamentally because, as you said, there are plenty of people who just really, really support means testing. I describe them as means testing fetishists because the idea to these people that somebody would get something that they don't need is far more egregious to them someone doesn't get something, someone doesn't, they have 2%. And something I just cannot get with. I cannot agree with that position at all. But that's the position that they take. So trying to get them to apologise for something that they did, that they support ideologically, that they also have justified as being necessary under the £22 billion black hole narrative they've gone with, they're never going to do it. There's no way they'd ever would do it. And so trying to bang on at them to do it, I think doesn't really have much weight to it. And that it's not just, something we were forced to do, like Liz Kendall saying, we didn't want to do it, but we've had to do it to try and take the 22 billion black hole the Tories have left us seriously. Ray Trues was banging on about this in 2014. Like, this isn't a new idea of their politics of deficit reduction to go around that narrative that they're trying to pull around this black hole. So again, they haven't picked up out of nowhere. It's not something they forced to have done. It's something they genuinely believe in and they have wanted to do for a very long time. There's no way you're going to get them to apologise. What I do find interesting, though, is that the press are desperate. They're desperate to get Keir Starmer to apologise for doing a policy they said they would do 10 years ago. Desperate to get him to apologise for, doing things which look pretty grubby but aren't breaking the rules. How many times do you think they found Conservative ministers and say, would you like to apologise for United Nations representatives saying that your government was violating the human rights of the disabled? Would you like to apologise for all of the additional excess deaths during the austerity regime? No decisions that were necessary for apologies from the Conservative government when they were in power. Yet the Labour government suddenly has to apologise for everything. Now, it's true. There should be scrutiny of the Labour government, and I'm glad finally Keir Starmer and his cronies are getting scrutinised by the media in a way that they really weren't in the run-up to the election. But it still does seem to me like things that are definitely worthy of scrutiny were never worthy of scrutiny under the Conservative Party when they both should be. As for this particular story about the penthouse, it really does feel like a kind of fly in the ointment at this point. We've heard so many of these different stories, and having access to a room that is obviously very expensive, rather than something that is like a new thing being bought with new money, rather than access to property that is not getting paid extra for, like they're not donating money, they're just having access to something that already exists. That doesn't make as much difference to me as plenty of the other donations and gifts that we've seen that have a tangible monetary value that wouldn't have existed had they not had this in with the Labour Party.
I think this is one of those stories, I've been thinking about this, a bit like Partygate, where actually, because people say this is a storm in a teacup being driven by the media. And, in some level, it is being driven by the media. But I think what's making the media keep reporting it sort of with such vigor is actually because it's making their viewers kind of more angry than they expected. So with Partygate, some of those stories, when they first came out, I was a bit like, considering all of the things that have been going on over the past 2 years, this is not the thing that really makes me that angry, right? The parties didn't look that great. There were much bigger scandals during the COVID period, but it just made people mad right? And I think understandably so, right? And that's what drove the media coverage. And I think this Giftgate thing is similar, because journalists, there aren't actually that many careers where you do get free stuff. But journalism is one of them, right? I mean, I'm not a successful enough journalist to get offered many free stuff, but every now and again I get an email where it said, you want to come to this, press viewing of a play or whatever. I'm not there for work because I'm not going to write a review about it, but I might go to this press viewing of a play. And so I think there'll be lots of journalists who get a lot more freebies than I do, who sort of saw this story and they're like, oh, you know what, he got offered this freebie, his family wanted it, blah, blah, blah. I'm not that outraged by it, but they found that their viewers, their audience, were infuriated, because it's actually very rare to have a job where people offer you free stuff and you're allowed to take it. I know if you're a teacher and if you get given a box of chocolates, you have to fill out a bunch of forms. If you work in the NHS, you have to do the same. There was a story about a street cleaner where some people had raised some money on GoFundMe so that he could go on holiday. And the private company who hired this guy said that wasn't allowed because it would be tantamount to corruption. So this story, I don't think, is being driven by the press. I think it's being driven by sort of like an outrage and an anger from the public that Labour were completely sort of out of touch about how this would read to most people, as were most journalists. So I think this has almost been a bit of a surprise to everyone. And yeah, Labour probably should have realised earlier that this would piss people off. And I think probably they are going to have to apologise at some point, because they have got this massively wrong. There is another scandal brewing. This is one that seems to provoke less anger among the public, although the one that a journalist like me is maybe a bit more interested in. That's because Labour have appointed former climate chief Rachel Kite as climate envoy, a role which was previously axed by Rishi Sunak. And this is what's interesting here. Kite is currently co-chair of the Climate Advisory Board of Quadrature Climate Foundation. We talked about that yesterday. That's linked to Quadrature Hedge Fund. Quadrature is the fund that recently gave Labour a £4 million donation, just as the general election was called, but which was only revealed last week. Some of this story is a bit of a red herring. So they've been sort of talked about this company that invests lots of money in fossil fuels. They are a hedge fund that sort of seems to do their investments via algorithms, and they could be betting against as many oil companies as they are betting for. So they're not necessarily, they won't be lobbying the government to give concessions for oil companies, for example. But if you are a Cayman Islands-based hedge fund, there will be lots of policies that you will be in favour of. Transparency in tax havens, probably they're not going to be in favour of. And the fact that they donated Labour £4 million before the election, and now someone who's very much connected to their company has been given a plummy job. It might be the case that the guys who are at that hedge fund really care about climate change. This woman is clearly qualified for this kind of job if she was at the UN, I think it was before. But it stinks, doesn't it? You get a £4 million donation before the election, which you get in that 1 week window, which means that you don't have to declare it until 3 months later. And then someone from that offshore tax haven hedge fund gets a plummy job in your administration. Labour has been taking heat for accepting gifts from the wealthy, but now some of the wealthy are getting annoyed. They're not getting enough in return. According to the Times, business leaders are demanding a refund after paying £3,000 for a rip-off conference event. So they had bought tickets to a business day at Labour conference and had expected to meet ministers, to sort of find out what was going on in this government, what connections they could make. But they were left disappointed when all they did was watch the Chancellor's speech on a TV screen and then queue for ages for food and drinks. An executive from a well-known household brand told the Times, we paid £3,000 to come here, and what did we get? A live stream of Rachel Reeves' speech, and then to be made to queue in a bleak corridor for a drinks reception where there was no access for ministers. Now, look, Labour, you can take away winter fuel payments from older women with arthritis, but do not make top executives queue in bleak corridors for drink receptions. This is really going to backfire. Another said this: lunch was just stand-up sandwiches. They were standing up in a hot room, didn't even have aircon, with virtually no ministers visible. Last year, the Tories had a sit-down lunch with a cabinet minister on each table and a speech from the PM. funny thing is, Labour was really good at this in opposition. They will get fewer registrations and therefore fewer fees next year if they can't promise something better. So these execs are used to sitting down. They had to stand up. They're used to having how many cabinet ministers? If they had a cabinet minister on each table, that's like the whole cabinet there. That was under the Conservatives, of course. Labour not treating them quite as nicely. A Labour source said this in response. Last week, people had too much access to them, and now it's not enough. We can't win. Helena, I suppose you could spin this in Labour's favour. You could say, they say when they give us money, we don't give them anything in return. And we have some proof here that a bunch of people gave them $3,000 and they got nothing in return. So maybe this is, am I being too conspiratorial if I say they gave these business people a bad day out just so that they could prove that they're not actually corrupt and in their pockets?
I think it's more a case of a lot of people who aren't actually used to what it's like running these kind of things in the interest of business. It's not really giving adults in the room, to me, at the very least. But what's interesting about this is the expectations that these people had of what they would find at this supposed business day at a party conference. It shows you at the very least what the norm has been for the last 14 years, right? Obviously, they say that Labour did this better in opposition. Maybe they're too busy doing government business at this point. I'm willing to give them maybe a little bit of slack that, maybe there was time for them to go and meet with business leaders whilst they were in opposition and just formulating plans. Now that they actually have a role in governing the country, maybe they have more important things on their hands than having to cater to some people who've paid some money to go to a meeting. And to be fair, they did hear from Jonathan Reynolds. There was a question and answer session that they did attend, according to this Times article. It just wasn't this one-on-one drinks reception with ministers that they were expecting. But it should show you just how little that the Conservative Party, when they were in government, actually cared about the role of governance, in that they could get the whole cabinet into a whole room so people could be able to meet with them one-on-one. If they had the special access of being rich and wealthy and in charge of businesses, what the Conservative Party are there to represent. They are the political wing of capital. They're there to represent capital in Parliament in the same way that Labour should have been representing Labour in Parliament. Obviously, that's changed now. And also a very funny quote from this that I'll pull up too, which was that they said it was the party's one chance to show they changed and that they appreciate private enterprise now, but they clearly don't. It was a waste of money. And I'm like, well, surely political policy is what's going to be the proof in the pudding that shows you they care about the private sector. Now, they've said a bunch of things that the private sector should want to hear. We're going to give you investment. We're going to de-risk your capital with all of our different policy plans that previously were going to be much more publicly funded. And then they U-turned on after Rachel Reeves had a meeting with somebody at Davos who said, actually, do your investment plan so there's more private sector involvement, so the state is less involved. All you're doing is de-risking capital. I'm like, well, that's what you should be looking for when it comes to whether or not you think a political party is governing in your interest. It's how they craft policy. But the business community, quote unquote, are so used to having essentially a direct access as lobbyists, so direct access to politicians one-on-one, shows you the norm in this country. This was certainly the norm under the new Labour government as well, that for the last 45 years, essentially the norm in this country has been the political parties having direct access with business leaders and using that is where they end up crafting policy with, rather than having a political position that they stick to and then they implement when they get into government.
I do. I think that is a good quote, that one about this was their one chance to prove us they like private enterprise. Labour they've said they're not going to raise corporation tax. They said we're going to do sort of this massive round of planning reform, which is going to make investment so much easier. You're going to be able to build more. You can do onshore wind farms. As you say, we're going to de-risk a bunch of your investment. And the business leaders are just there saying, all I want is a seat to eat my sandwiches in. And that's really how you prove to these guys that you are for them. We should have told you the penthouse was, of course, from Lord Ali. Helena, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Always a pleasure, Michael. Always a pleasure spending my evening with you.
And they should have got Lord Wahid Ali to, I suppose, sort out the chairs and the tables and the corridor. He could have jazzed it up a little bit. Maybe that's what went wrong. Maybe he was going to fund the wonderful business reception, but now he's got a bit annoyed at all the coverage, and that's why they ended up just queuing in a dank corridor. Thank you, everyone, for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.